This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference. Today's call is on pollution from pesticides, how transnational chemical corporations violate basic human rights. Our guest speakers are Catherine Gillia of Pesticide Action Network, Jeannie Economos of Farm Worker Association of Florida, and Vi Wahi and Pam Miller of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment, and CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information on the following websites: healthandenvironment.org and akaction.org. On our website, which is www.akaction.org, you will also find an archive with recordings of past calls. Today's call will last 1 hour. Everyone who signed up by yesterday should have received an email this morning with a link to the call webpage where you will find speaker presentations and background materials. If you didn't receive the link or don't have it in front of you, you can go to the Alaska Community Action on Toxics homepage at akaction.org. Simply click on the title of today's call, which you will find in the upper left of our homepage, and this will bring you to the call webpage. Today we will be discussing how Arctic Indigenous peoples and Florida farm workers joined together with dozens of other communities worldwide in an international human rights case against the world's 6th largest pesticide manufacturers. There will be time at the end of the call for your questions and comments. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Catherine Gillia, Senior Organizer at Pesticide Action Network, or PAN. Catherine joined Pesticide Action Network in 2005 and has served as both co-director and executive director, and now as senior organizer. Prior to coming to PAN, Catherine co-founded and co-directed Centro Campesino, a Midwest organization of migrant farm workers and allies working for fair and healthy communities. She was senior associate with the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, where she focused on policy and market support for sustainable agriculture and reforming U.S. farm policy. Catherine has extensive experience working on food, agriculture, policy, and social justice issues in the United States and internationally. Welcome, Catherine. Would you like to begin?
Thank you so much, Diana, and thank you so much for hosting this important call. I'm very pleased to be here. So, as Diana said, my name is Catherine Gillia, and I work with Pesticide Action Network International. I am using a set of slides for my presentation, so hopefully you've been to the website and downloaded the slides. Pesticide Action Network, or PAN, was founded in 1982 to push for healthy and ecologically sound food and farming systems. We now number a partnership, a network of 600 organizations in more than 90 countries. As I begin the presentation today, and we talk about how transnational chemical corporations are violating basic human rights, I want to spend a moment on the story of Bhopal, a story that happened 28 years ago next month. The explosion in Bhopal happened in the early hours of the morning at a U.S.-owned pesticide plant that was 3 miles from the Indian city of Bhopal. Methyl isocyanate gas escaped when a valve in the plant's underground storage tank broke under pressure. This caused a deadly cloud of lethal gas to float from the factory over the city, home to more than 900,000 people. Chaos and panic broke out in the city and the surrounding area. Tens of thousands of people attempted to escape. One Bhopal resident said, "We were choking and our eyes were burning. We could barely see the road through the fog and the sirens were blaring." Everybody was very confused. Mothers didn't know that their children had died, children didn't know that their mothers had died, and men didn't know that their whole families had died. 28 years later, today, a strong social movement still is seeking justice and accountability from Dow Chemical. During this call today, we are going to share how Dow Chemical and the other parties in the Big Six Pesticide Corporation group regularly violate human rights, tragically similar to what happened in Bhopal. If you move on to the next slide, my main message as I give a brief overview today, before you hear the stories from Jeannie and Vi, is that the pesticide industry marketplace control and undue influence results in gross violations of the human right to life, health, and livelihood. along with other human rights violations that we'll be discussing. To talk about this, I'm going to give a brief overview of who are the Big Six, which corporations are we talking about when we say the Big Six, and how do they exert influence. I'll then talk about the Human Rights Tribunal that PAN organized with partners a year ago, and the human rights violations, the verdict of human rights violations that was found during that human rights case, and what some future steps for action are. So to my first point, who are the Big Six and how do they exert influence? I'm on slide 6. The Big Six are the handful of international pesticide corporations that control upwards of 70% of the global trade in pesticides, of the global pesticides market. These 6 corporations are Monsanto, Syngenta, Dow, Bayer, BASF, and DuPont. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see in slide 7 that these players also control the global seed markets. So this is the global market in both hybrid and genetically engineered seeds, which are increasingly bought by farmers rather than having farmers and communities save their own seed. This consolidation of the pesticide, seed, and agricultural biotech industries has meant that this handful, the Big Six, essentially control the terms when it comes to food and farming. They control the fate of what's going on. In slide 8, you'll see a little bit deeper dive of how this happens. In some ways, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but the left yellow circle shows how farmers end up on a pesticide and seed treadmill as they need to increase the number and the types of pesticides that they are using to control pests as pests develop resistance to pesticides, and as their ability to save their own seed decreases as they purchase seed, and as the Big Six put proprietary claims increasingly on seeds and don't allow farmers to save seed. So this is one aspect, kind of the marketplace control of the Big Six is one way they exert influence. On slides 9 and 10, I'm going to briefly talk about other things that we're extremely concerned about. One being the undue influence of the Big Six on science and the way that it has essentially undermined the effective use of science in policy and public decision making. This is done by suppressing science and ignoring science as they move to bring their products, their pesticides, to market. It's done as we have defunded our public universities and the places that are looking at food and agriculture and how it's best grown and done. And the Big Six have stepped in and funded our agricultural land grants and are basically controlling the terms of a lot of that research. And it's done, unfortunately, through skewing studies, scientific studies themselves. And this quote here on slide 9 refers to a review of over 1,000 biomedical studies, which found that industry-sponsored studies were significantly more likely to reach conclusions favorable to industry. This particular research goes beyond the Big Six, but we've seen similar things when folks have reviewed a set of research where perhaps Syngenta has sponsored, for example, or funded or been involved in research around atrazine. A similar review has been done and found such a skew. And the final thing I'm going to talk about here when I talk about the undue influence of the Big Six is the way that the Big Six have undue influence on policy in the US and globally. This is just one example on slide 10 of something that we recently experienced here in California when we worked to pass a proposition that would have required the labeling of genetically engineered foods. As you saw from a previous slide, the Big Six are heavily involved in the genetically engineered seed industry and have much at stake when it comes to not having this be very transparent. So as we move forward to pass Proposition 37 to label genetically engineered foods here in California, we saw a tremendous influx of money from the Big Six opposing this labeling initiative, which eventually did not pass by a narrow margin, although millions of Californians did indeed vote in favor of labeling genetically engineered foods. So from pouring money into specific legislative proposition or policy efforts, lobbying, we also are facing a revolving door where industry representatives come from industry, sit in important positions in our government, perhaps in the Food and Drug Administration or at the USDA, other agencies that are overseeing food and agriculture pesticides. And we are also seeing how these corporations really have figured out how to capture, for the most part, the regulatory process in the U.S. when it comes to pesticides and chemicals. So, having given that brief review of the control and the influence of the Big Six, I'd like to talk now about the violations of human rights that's resultant in the U.S. and around the world, unfortunately. And I'm going to do that by telling the story of the Human Rights Tribunal that PAN and partners organized a year ago in December, which happened in Bangalore, India. And I'm going to spend a few minutes on why we organized this tribunal. Basically, PAN is made up of communities and organizations from around the world who are working very hard to undo the human health and environmental harms from pesticides and pesticide reliance, and working very hard to promote healthy, safe food and agricultural methods, food sovereignty, food democracy, agroecology, these sorts of things. And time again, the barrier that these communities and organizations run up against is this control and influence of the Big Six pesticide industry players. For that reason, we decided together that it was time to do something to work toward creating a binding mechanism that would hold these corporations accountable, because without that, we will not, in the end, achieve our goals or our mission. And we don't have that sort of binding mechanism now. And so we decided to put together a global human rights case that really made the case, laid out the evidence from a scientific perspective and from the stories of survivors of these human rights violations in order to present the case for how the Big Six are violating human rights. Moving to slide 14, I'll say one other thing about the tribunal before I move on. The tribunal was hosted by a group called the Permanent Peoples Tribunal, which is a separate nonprofit organization which holds cases like this in the absence of other international venues or legally binding venues, and has been used throughout history as a way to begin to establish the case and the need for such an international binding court and mechanisms. So our key partners in the U.S. on this, there are partners from all around the world, but I really want to mention the hard work that was put into this by the partners here on slide 14, Alaska Community Action on Toxics, Farm Worker Association of Florida, Center for Food Safety, some key scientists. We also had significant submission from the International Indian Treaty Council on human rights violations experienced by indigenous communities. So this was an effort by many organizations and people around the world. And as I explain the different human rights charges and then get to the verdict at the end of this Human Rights Tribunal, I'm going to do that by just showing these pictures and sharing some of the stories of the witnesses who presented during the tribunal. So on slide 15, I want to introduce you first to our team of attorneys. This was an international team of attorneys who worked with all of the organizations to develop and present a 275-page indictment, which listed the human rights violations, the charges against the Big Six corporations in rigorous detail. Another reason that we really wanted to do this tribunal was to be rigorous about the way that we were examining the evidence around violation of human rights. And this team of attorney worked for years with these organizations to present the indictment. So the first case that I want to share here on slide 16 revolves around the violations of the rights of women and children. And I want to share that I wanted to start with this slide because these two girls, this is one girl, but there were two girls that came forward who were young girls and presented their story, which reflects the story of about 170,000 children below 14 years old, mostly girls, who are working in cotton plantations in India. In exchange for low wages, the child workers are regularly exposed to highly toxic pesticides, such as endosulfan, and that's one you're going to hear come up several times. This is a persistent pesticide that has been used over the years and is now, thankfully, on global phase-out as part of the Stockholm Convention, although we have to work very hard to make sure that phase-out happens. They're also exposed to other pesticides. These girls are exposed to these pesticides at critical moments of development. They're younger than 14 years old. You know, their brains and their bodies are developing. they've experienced acute poisoning, but they also are exposed to chemicals, cancer-causing chemicals, endocrine-disrupting chemicals, which have impacts on health later in life. The next slide, slide 17, shows Dave Runyon, who is a U.S. farmer who got on a jet plane for the first time in his life to travel to southern India and present the case of U.S. farmers versus Monsanto. And this case is really about the right to livelihood and the right to food sovereignty and how the Big Six violate the rights to livelihood. Dave Runyon testified about how Monsanto, rather than, they don't respect the farmer's right to save seed anymore and accuse farmers of seed piracy, more or less. Monsanto has taken these farmers to court for their alleged intellectual property rights infringement after they've sent investigators onto farms and found seed that is genetically engineered on farms. And David Runyon testified, for example, that a Monsanto attorney during his time battling Monsanto had said that taking money from a farmer is like taking candy from a baby. So this case was really meant to demonstrate how the monopoly control of the Big Six has led to the loss of livelihoods and loss of food sovereignty. Slide 18 is one of a series of cases, reflects one of a series of cases which demonstrated the Big Six violations of the right to life and health by directly causing death, injury, and chronic and irreversible ill health to human beings. This case was brought forward by a woman named Namaga, who is a plantation worker in Malaysia. She was exposed to the pesticide paraquat manufactured by Syngenta, and it is used in approximately 30,000, mostly women workers in the palm oil plantations in Malaysia. She testified to how she left her job when she was 45 years old because of her ill health due to paraquat poisoning. She testified, for example, that paraquat is banned in Switzerland, where Syngenta is located, their home state, and she asked why is it then still sold and used in Malaysia. And this is a theme that resonates around the world where people are facing violations of their right to health and to life. Next slide, 19, is a case that demonstrates, again, violations of the right to life and health. These men brought forward testimonies from the area of Kerala, India, where the pesticide endosulfan was airily sprayed from 1976 to 2002, and there have been significant health harms, congenital, reproductive, neurological damage, and other health effects among more than 9,000 villagers. Slide 20. In slide 20, we see the global connection. This is Vai Wagigi, who you will hear later in this call, and she presented through video her testimony about chemicals that were used just like the ones that were used by the men who were talking about the community in India in slide 19. These chemicals, which are persistent organic pollutants, migrate on wind and water currents around the world and end up in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, contaminating the Arctic, the animals, and the peoples of the Arctic. And Vi will tell you much more about the violations of the right to life and health experienced by her nation and community. The next slide, 21, we go to the case in Brazil. This was presented by a Brazilian farmer who's pictured here, talking about the harassment by the Big Six, and in particular Syngenta. And again, this farmer presented his case around the loss of food sovereignty. Syngenta went into Brazil and illegally planted genetically engineered seeds, and farmers occupied the land. Since policymakers weren't taking action against this illegal planting near ecosystem-sensitive sites, the farmers occupied the land. And in turn, Syngenta hired paramilitary forces that came in and killed one of his comrades and injured others. And he presented the case against Syngenta, the violations of human rights that he and his community have experienced. Two more cases I'm just going to share briefly. There were There were 35 cases documented, many, many witnesses. This was a very comprehensive global tribunal. So I'm picking a few of the key cases to give you a sense of the breadth of witnesses from the different continents and the ways that these folks put forward the violations of human rights. So slide 22, we had Dr. Tyrone Hayes, who came from the United States to testify about the harassment of scientists who are engaged in research around pesticides. And in this case, he testified about Syngenta and their attempts to harass and discredit Dr. Tyrone Hayes, who he's been studying the negative effects of Syngenta's pesticide atrazine. Dr. Hayes said that, quote, Syngenta asked him to manipulate data, hide data, or purchase his data, and that he refused. He talked about, along with other scientists, talked about how they lose their funding and become isolated from the rest of the scientific community at times when they are studying the potential adverse effects of the chemicals that the pesticide industry is working to sell. So he was presenting the case of how the Big Six have undermined science and independent research. And finally, I want to share with you that there were 2 beekeepers who joined and presented their case of the loss of food sovereignty and really ecosystem harm. And they presented the drastic decline of bee populations across the world, known by some as colony collapse disorder, which started in the mid-1990s. And they presented the association with the timing of Bayer introducing their class of neonicotinoid pesticides and the science that is showing a link between exposure to neonicotinoid pesticides as a piece of the puzzle when it comes to the dramatic bee declines. So that gives you a flavor of how the human rights violations were presented and the testimonies that were offered. Slide 24 shows you the jury. For the tribunal, this was an esteemed jury of experts from around the world who heard the evidence, who reviewed the 275-page indictment, and who then, after deliberations, put forward a verdict. And the verdict is summarized on slides 25 and 26. Basically, the jury found the Big Six guilty as charged and responsible for gross, widespread, and systemic violations of a variety of human rights that are listed here: health and life, economic, social and cultural rights, civil, political rights, women and children's rights, as well as responsible for the violation of indigenous peoples' human rights and other entitlements. On slide 26, I wanted to bring up the fact that they also, alongside the Big Six, found 3 particular nations culpable, including the United States, Switzerland, and Germany, as the home states for these pesticide corporations. So I'm going to end here, but I wanted to say on slide 27 some ways that we are moving forward after the tribunal, and I'm sure that Jeannie and Vi will also touch on this. But we have an opportunity right now in the U.S. The Big Six, members of the Big Six are putting forward new genetically engineered seeds which are resistant to several different pesticides, and the approval is on the desk of the USDA right now. And so we have a petition urging Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack not to approve these genetically engineered seeds. It's also important that we continue to support the organizing and action for survivors of human rights violations. So the work of Farm Worker Association of Florida, Alaska Community Action on Toxics, and many other groups, which is working alongside survivors to make sure that survivors receive medical attention, basic needs because of what they've gone through, and are also working for policy change. And immediately coming up, we are engaging in a December 10th Joint Day of Action, which I think we'll talk about later in the call, but I wanted to just let you know that my colleague at PAN, Devika Gai, is organizing that coordinated day of action alongside the groups that have been working, that worked on this Human Rights Tribunal and are working to expose the human rights violations of the pesticide industry. I've included her email here if you would like to get involved in that. That is what I have for now. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. We're so pleased you could join us today. And if folks have questions for Catherine, please just hold on to those questions until the end of the call, and we'll have an opportunity to hear more from her. I want to thank you for sharing for providing the context for Jeannie and Vi to discuss human rights violations against Florida farm workers and Arctic communities, and for touching on the many other stories of communities and scientists. Thank you so much, Catherine. Now I would like to welcome and introduce Jeannie Economos. Jeannie is the Pesticide Safety and Environmental Health Project Coordinator for the Farm Worker Association of Florida. She has over 20 years experience working on issues of the environment, environmental justice, indigenous and immigrants' rights, labor, peace, and social justice. She joined with the Farm Worker Association of Florida in 1996 as the Lake Apopka Project Coordinator and has served in her current position as Pesticide Safety and Environmental Health Project Coordinator since 2007. Jeannie works extensively with communities where former farm workers suffer debilitating health impacts as a result of being forced to work in harsh conditions and in close contact with dangerous pesticides. Each year, Jeannie trains over 500 farm workers in Florida on their rights and protections in the workplace and how to protect themselves and their families from pesticide exposure. She is currently co-coordinator of the Lake Apopka Farm Workers Memorial Quilt Project, whose purpose is to raise awareness about the impacts of pesticides on the former farm workers on Lake Apopka. Welcome, Jeannie. Would you like to begin?
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Catherine, for that great overview and discussion about the Permanent Peoples Tribunal. Really appreciate that and appreciate the opportunity to be on this call today. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about about Lake Apopka and the environmental issues around Lake Apopka, and then move from there into the environmental justice issues with the farm workers. But I think it's important to understand a little bit about the ecological problems on the lake. So Lake Apopka is in central Florida. It's about 20 miles away from Disney World, and it used to be the second largest lake in the state. In the 1940s, the U.S. government was looking for land to grow crops for the war effort, and so this large lake was diked and dammed. About 20,000 acres on the north shore of the lake were actually drained of water to create the rich muck soil that was used to plant vegetable crops. So from the 1940s until 1998, so a good 50 years, that 20,000 acres was farmed in all kinds of vegetables from carrots, radishes, cucumbers, and even herbs and lettuces. And of course, in the 1940s and 50s and even into the 1960s, some of the worst pesticides were being used on in the United States and were also being used on the crops on Lake Apopka. Florida has a very long growing season. We're unlike other states. So our growing season in Florida is from September all the way in through May. And so what would happen on Lake Apopka is that from during the growing season, the water would be pumped off of the farmlands and just enough would be pumped on to irrigate the fields. And then in the summertime when there were no crops, it was too hot to grow crops in Florida, the water would be pumped from the lake back onto the farmland to both control for weeds and to also prevent oxidation of the soil. So you can imagine what's happening. For 50 years, there's this flow of water from Lake Apopka onto the fields, and then from the fields back into the lake. Well, you can't have that kind of flow of water without having the pesticides and fertilizers from the land also flowing with that. And so Lake Apopka in the 1960s started looking really bad, and it became an embarrassment for the governments in Central Florida, and also the tourist industry that had built up around Lake Apopka began to decline. So efforts were made to begin to clean up Lake Apopka. Unfortunately, most of those efforts were focused on phosphorus runoff from the farms, and not many people were looking at pesticides. And so efforts were made to try and control the fertilizer runoff, and different strategies were suggested to try and control that. But in the 1980s, a scientist from the University of Florida began doing alligator studies on Lake Apopka. And at that time, he was laughed at by the scientific community around the world because he was beginning to see things on the alligator population on Lake Apopka that were very disturbing. He found that the alligators were having very low reproductive rates. There were male alligators with very high estrogen levels and female alligators with high testosterone levels, birth defects, all kinds of anomalies among the alligator population, which he eventually linked to a spill of DDT pesticide at the south end of Lake Apopka at the Tower Chemical Company site. Well, at that time, his research was scoffed at. Today, it's known that he did some of the seminal research on endocrine disrupting chemicals in the environment, and now he travels around the world speaking about his research and how these chemicals in our environment are affecting not only wildlife, but what that could mean for human health also. So that was the first big indicator for people that were paying attention to pesticide issues. That was a real real concern and a real kind of wake-up call. However, again, that didn't really surface until years later when his research was validated by other scientific research that came along. The farms actually closed. The state of Florida purchased the farms on Lake Apopka and shut the farms down forever in 1998. And the farmland was then reflooded at an unseasonable time. And this is important because it talks about it expresses the other impacts on wildlife that happen on Lake Apopka. The farmland was flooded during the fall bird migration, and thousands of birds were flying overhead and saw shallow marshland on Lake Apopka and landed there. And it was actually one of the largest bird counts ever of any inland area in the entire United States. And so birders were all very excited to see this great bird population until the birds began dying. Over 1,000 birds died in one of the worst bird mortality incidents in the United States. And the bird deaths were eventually linked to toxaphene, which is in a class of pesticides, the same class as DDT, a class of organochlorine pesticides. So we have a couple of things happening here. We have these alligator deaths and we have the bird deaths. However, for those 50 years that the farmland was being farmed, there were people that harvested the crops on that land, and that's the farm workers. Some of them worked there for generations. Some of them were there as children when their parents worked in the fields. And to this day, there have been no scientific studies to look at and address the health impacts to the farm workers that were exposed to the same chemicals that caused endocrine disruption among the alligators and the bird deaths on Lake Apopka. The Farm Worker Association of Florida has been addressing and organizing and working with this community even before the farms closed on Lake Apopka for over 30 years. And the community of former Lake Apopka farm workers is still fighting to this day. A lot of the older farm workers have passed away, and a lot of their concerns are that some of their illnesses and premature deaths could be related to chronic exposure to pesticides. There are a few materials on the website, including an environmental health survey that the Farm Worker Association did that looks at some of the health impacts and some of the chronic illnesses that the farm workers are experiencing. There's also a YouTube video on the website where some of the farm workers are speaking on their own behalf about the impacts to their health. One of the most recent things that they have done is they've created a memorial quilt in memory of their friends and family and co-workers that have died since the farms closed on Lake Apopka. In closing, this is a very long and complicated story, and I'm just touching on it, but I want to say that a ray of hope came when Pesticide Action Network began the work on the Permanent Peoples Tribunal, and the Farm Worker Association of Florida and the community of farm workers on Lake Apopka are very grateful and gratified to have been part of the efforts of the Permanent Peoples Tribunal. And because these people have been exposed to persistent organic pollutants, and we are very excited to take the next steps forward with PAN and the other partners on the PPT. With that, I'll go ahead and close and take questions later. Again, it's a very long, complicated issue, but I think that one of the key things about Lake Apopka is the intersection of this environmental and wildlife disaster and the environmental justice issues of the Lake Apopka farm workers. So with that, I'll close, and I'll be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie. And I know that is a big story to try to tell in so little time. So again, everyone, there's other resources on the web at akaction.org. And in addition, Jeannie will be available later for your questions. So thank you again, Jeannie. Next, I'd like to introduce Vi Wahi. Vi is the Environmental Health and Justice Program Director at Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Vi is a Yupik mother and grandmother from the village of Savunga on St. Lawrence Island, Alaska. She joined the ACAT team in 2002. In 2010, Vi was awarded the Environmental Achievement Award in recognition of valuable contributions to environmental excellence in Alaska, an award given by the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. She serves as a National Advisory Environmental Health Sciences Council member, which advises the director of the National Institute of Health. Vi provided a witness statement and testimony in ACAT's Arctic case to the Permanent Peoples Tribunal. Welcome, Vi. Oh, you'll have to press star 2 to unmute yourself.
Good morning. Thank you, Diana. Also to Catherine and to Jeannie for their presentation. As Diana mentioned, my name is Vi Wahi. I'm the daughter of the late John and Della Wahi from Savunga, which is located in St. Lawrence Island. I'm a Yupik mother of 4 boys and a grandmother. I'm a tribal member of the native village of Savunga. And as Diana mentioned, I am also Environmental Health and Justice Program Director with Alaska Community Action on Toxics. St. Lawrence Island is located in the northern Bering Sea. We are closer to Russia than to mainland Alaska. We have 2 villages with about 800 people in each community. And before pre-Western contact, we had 4,000 people in 32 villages. And our people have relied on the land and ocean for many generations for our physical and spiritual sustenance. And traditional foods are fundamental to the health and well-being of our Yupik people, our traditional cultures and subsistence way of life, a way of life passed on for many, many generations. We hunt, harvest, and gather foods, including bowhead whales, walrus, seals, fish, reindeer, greens, berries to sustain us. And our traditional foods are the basis for our cultural unity, social, and our economic means. For our people, our subsistence way of life and food gathering are an essential element of our social well-being for our entire community. The health and well-being of Arctic indigenous peoples are connected intimately to the climate, wildlife, and our land spiritually, culturally, and traditionally. The role of subsistence food is essential to the identity of our cultures and very important to our survival. Due to the high cost of living in our rural communities in Alaska, our traditional foods improve the health and well-being of our people. In our communities, a lot of people cannot afford store-bought foods that are overpriced because everything has to be flown in. Canned and processed foods are not viable or healthy for us, and often subsistence food substitutes may not be locally available or affordable, plus no way to make sure they are nutritious. Often there are no other options or are even considered in most communities that rely on subsistence foods for our survival as a people and culture. Our traditional foods are the fundamental components of our indigenous people's culture, but now also the major source of exposures to pesticides and other industrial chemicals without our consent. Our traditional foods are highly contaminated with chemicals that are transported on wind and ocean currents into the Arctic from more southerly latitudes throughout the hemisphere. The Arctic has become a hemispheric sink for these pesticides and other industrial chemicals that now contaminate our lands, our wildlife, and the indigenous people of the North. These chemicals are trapped in the cold environment and concentrate in the bodies of our Arctic wildlife and people. These pesticides are not manufactured in the Arctic, yet they are arriving at our doorsteps. Most of these pesticides are carried on wind and ocean currents from the areas where they are manufactured or used into the Arctic. Our Arctic indigenous people suffer levels of contamination of these persistent organic pollutants in our blood and the breast milk of our mothers that are among the highest of any population on the planet, even though these chemicals have never been produced in the Arctic. These pesticides and other industrial chemicals threaten the health and survival of our indigenous people of the Arctic. Also, hazardous waste sites left by the military since the Cold War was also a source of continuing contamination of the Arctic because some of these pesticides were used and disposed in the Arctic by the U.S. military. The military came in the late 1940s during the Cold War and established two formerly used defense sites. And we have had a community-based participatory research project to address our concerns from the military contamination, but also these global sources. And as part of our community-based project, we've identified DDT, Lendane, Mirex, and HCB from the two contaminated military sites. And we know that many pesticides, including the DDT, HCB, chlordane, deldrin, toxaphene, Lendane, and endosulfan are contaminating our lands, the Arctic, our traditional foods, and our bodies. Levels of these pesticides are still rising in the Arctic, although some have been banned or restricted through the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. Dioxins, which are often produced as a byproduct of pesticide manufacturing, also are contaminating the Arctic. Current use pesticides, including chlorpyrifos, are also contaminating the Arctic and found extensively in air, water, and fish. All of the implicated corporations manufacture or have manufactured pesticides that contaminate the Arctic. Syngenta introduced DDT and chlordane. DDT is currently manufactured for malaria vector control by the governments of India, China, and North Korea. Bayer introduced endosulfan, which at present is manufactured by several other companies, including the government of India. In addition to the legacy pesticides that are still accumulating in the Arctic, currently used pesticides are contaminating the Arctic, including chlorpyrifos, manufactured by Dow, and atrazine, manufactured by Syngenta. Plus, other current use pesticides have been found through studies of the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. I just want to share with you an example of changes that are happening to our cultural practices from our traditional lifestyle and ways we have to adapt. My sons are young men and are hunters and food gatherers. During Mur egg harvesting, Murs are seabirds. My son Kaya climbs down very steep cliffs to collect these Mur eggs, which is a dangerous feat in itself. But we now know that these seabird eggs, a valued subsistence food, are contaminated with pesticides such as endosulfan. These contaminants are more dangerous to his health and future well-being. Our teething babies are given frozen whale, walrus, seal blubber, an ancient tried and true tradition. Now mothers must make a choice to continue this or find other methods to soothe her baby's teething. Choices are now being forced on our people by the production and use of pesticides. These corporations are contaminating our bodies without our consent and threatening our very survival. We are suffering unprecedented illnesses such as reproductive problems, thyroid and heart disease, diabetes, and the main cause of death in our people, cancer. The vital foods that have sustained our people for many, many generations are now killing us. The U.S. government and other signing nations made an assurance to the people to monitor the levels of and assess the effects of pollutants in all components of the Arctic environment and take preventive and other measures directly or through competent international organizations regarding marine pollution in the Arctic, irrespective of origin. This is from the AMAP that I mentioned earlier. The government has the obligation and responsibility to protect its people from harmful contaminants. The Stockholm Convention on POPs explicitly acknowledges that Arctic ecosystems and indigenous communities are particularly at risk. The governments and corporations of the world must protect the health and human rights of indigenous people. The U.S. signed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Our basic human rights are being violated. We have a human right to food and subsistence, human right to health, clean air, clean water, and toxic-free food. We need to protect the health and well-being of our indigenous peoples, our children, and future generations who deserve to gain the cultures and traditions passed on for generations from our ancestors. We are up against multinational corporate interests. The chemical industry is big business and profit drives their decisions. The monetary gains of a few must not drive their interests. These decisions disproportionately harm the indigenous people of the Arctic. I call on you to assist to address the environmental health injustices done to my Yupik people of St. Lawrence Island and of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. The production and use of these harmful chemicals must end. The corporations are contaminating us without our consent and affecting our lands, our subsistence foods, the health and well-being of our people, our children and future generations, our tradition and cultures. They must be held accountable and prevented from causing further harm. At this time, I'd like to thank Pesticide Action Network for this opportunity on the human rights case and to voice our concerns and our basic human rights that have been violated, and also to Catherine, since I was not able to go, as you saw from her PowerPoint presentation. She presented my Arctic witness testimony and also the Arctic case on behalf of us. And, you know, these toxic pesticides are causing cancer. And as mentioned, endocrine disrupting chemicals. We have so many people that are getting cancer disproportionately. We have some of the most highest birth defects in the lower 48 and twice as much as white infants in the state. So this is just a short presentation I wanted to provide on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vi, as always, for sharing your powerful story and the urgency of the threats to your people. Finally, I'd like to invite Pam Miller, Executive Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, to say a few words about ACAT's engagement in the Stockholm Convention and why international action is so important to protect the health of Arctic indigenous peoples. Just last month, Pam attended a week-long meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, where she and other colleagues with the International POPs Elimination Network provided critical information to the scientific committee that makes decisions about whether or not to ban certain persistent chemicals. Would you like to begin, Pam?
Yes, thank you so much, Diana. And I'd also like to thank Catherine and Jeannie It's really been an honor to be a partner with Pesticide Action Network and other organizations in this collective work for health, human rights, and justice. And good morning, everyone. I'll say a few words about the Stockholm Convention and also just point out that I wrote a short article about it that's posted on our website at akaction.org. The Stockholm Convention is particularly significant as a means to protect the health of the Arctic environment and the people because it addresses persistent toxic chemicals that can migrate long distances on wind and ocean currents, as Vi described. These chemicals accumulate in the fat-rich food webs of northern environments, and as Vi mentioned also, Arctic indigenous peoples have among the highest levels of these persistent chemicals in blood and breast milk of any population on Earth, even though most of these chemicals have never been produced in the Arctic. And this knowledge actually inspired the nations of the world to come together to resolve this incredible public health issue and negotiate what is now known as the Stockholm Convention. We also know that exposure to low levels of these persistent organic pollutant chemicals can harm human health, including interference with learning and development, diseases of the immune system, reproductive disorders, and cancers. And the convention is strongly based on the precautionary principle, which is very important to all of the civil society organizations that came together to negotiate and work on this important treaty. And it does recognize that Arctic ecosystems and indigenous communities are particularly at risk because of the biomagnification of these chemicals, and that contamination of traditional foods is a very serious public health issue for the Arctic. The Stockholm Convention was adopted by governments from around the world in 2001, entered into force in 2004 when 50 nations ratified the treaty, and currently the convention includes more than 180 nations or parties that agree to work together toward global elimination of the world's most dangerous chemicals. It's a living treaty that includes provisions to add new chemicals that meet scientific criteria for persistence, long-range transport, adverse health effects, and bioaccumulation. In addition to the initial list of 12 chemicals that were included in the convention, the so-called Dirty Dozen, and I'll just name them: aldrin, chlordane, DDT, dieldrin, endrin, heptachlor, Mirex, toxaphene, hexachlorobenzene, PCBs, dioxins, and furans. Some of those chemicals you heard mentioned in previous presentations. These parties agreed then in 2009 to add 9 new additional substances, and an additional pesticide, endosulfan, was added in 2011. The U.S., it's important to know, has not yet ratified this important treaty. It has to be ratified by the U.S. Senate and does not participate constructively in its implementation. The scientific committee of the Stockholm Convention, called the POPs Review Committee, works to determine whether chemicals that are nominated for inclusion under the convention meet the scientific criteria and warrant global action. ACAT is part of a small group of non-governmental organizations that collaborate with the International POPs Elimination Network and participate in these week-long scientific meetings each year. We participate in plenary and work group sessions throughout the day and evening, offering scientific evidence to advance consideration of the chemicals. We also provide the perspective of civil society to ensure the application of the precautionary principle and the scientific integrity of the work of the convention. We are up against a large contingent of representatives of the international chemical corporations, including the major manufacturers of pesticides and other industrial chemicals. And it's important to know that the Stockholm Convention is a living treaty that includes provisions to add new chemicals that meet the scientific criteria for persistence, long-range transport, adverse effects, and bioaccumulation. The POPs Review Committee makes determinations about whether these chemicals meet the criteria. In October of just last month, the POPs Review Committee came together and made some important decisions about some chemicals, all of which are found to have extremely adverse health effects and are found in the Arctic ubiquitously. And I don't have time to go into the details about each of these chemicals, but I'll just name them and I'll refer you to my article on our website for more information, or feel free to contact us. The POPs Review Committee took action on a chemical that will now go forward to the full conference of the parties of all the 182 nations. That's hexachlorocyclododecane. Again, these don't come tripping off the tongue, but they're important chemicals that are found ubiquitously in the global environment. And this one is used in polystyrene installation, and this will go forward for the full conference of parties to decide about whether to eliminate this chemical on a global basis. Short-chain chlorinated paraffins, another industrial chemical. Chlorinated naphthalenes. Hexachlorobutadiene, another industrial chemical that's a byproduct of the manufacture of chlorinated solvents. Pentachlorophenol, which is used as a wood preservative and also formerly used as a pesticide in agriculture. The POPs Review Committee also made important decisions about how climate change exacerbates the effects of persistent pollutants in the environment through the mobilization and transport of these chemicals. And they also made decisions to advance alternatives to pesticides, including DDT and endosulfan. So that's all I have time for today, but I'd be glad to answer any questions, and I want to make sure there's time for discussion with the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Again, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for sharing their time, expertise, and stories with us today. Are you all able to just stay 5 minutes over so that we have a little more time for questions? I'm hoping that that's possible. We would now like to open the lines for your questions and comments. If you would like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line, and please also state your name and affiliation.
Hello, I have a question for Vi. This is Fran Solomon from the Evergreen State College in Tacoma, Washington. Yeah, you mentioned many of the chemicals that are found at high levels in indigenous peoples are endocrine disruptors. So I was wondering if the incidence of breast cancer is higher in women, indigenous women in Alaska than in the lower 48.
Thank you for that good question. I just want to state that breast cancer and all cancers are increasing in indigenous people of the Arctic and in Alaska. Illnesses never seen before. We have lived a subsistence lifestyle for many generations, and our foods are very protective. However, the assault from these global sources have greatly affected the health and well-being of our people. So breast cancer and all kinds of cancers are happening disproportionately. I have 4 family members. We just buried one last week from cancer. So illnesses that are widespread. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your excellent presentation.
We have time for one more question. If there are no other questions, are there any other questions? If not, I'd like to just invite Catherine and Jeannie to make any closing remarks that they would like to make.
Thank you so much, Diana. I just want to say thank you very much for hosting this important call, and thank you to Jeannie and to Vi and to Pam for their hard work in an ongoing way and their testimony today. And we look forward to working together. We have to continue our work to build public will and political will to hold these corporations accountable. It's fundamental to our future success, and we look forward to working alongside you toward that end.
Thank you, Catherine. Jeannie, would you like to say anything else before we go for the day?
I just want to thank everyone who took the time to be on this call and to care about these issues. And I also want to thank ACAT and Catherine and Vi. It's a great honor to us to be a part of this with everyone, and we're stronger than we are individually. And there's an African saying that a spider web is small, but a spider is small, but a spider web can tie up a tiger. And so I hope that together we can tie up these big six corporations and get justice for all of our people, for farm workers, for indigenous people across the globe, and for all communities that are affected by these pesticide companies that are doing harm to human health and to the environment. So we're very happy and proud to be a part of such a great group, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Again, thank you to everyone for joining us today. And if you value our Che Alaska calls, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to Alaska Community Action on Toxics in whatever amount is right for you. Thanks to a special grant, your donation will be matched dollar for dollar by Groundswell's Catalyst Fund, and you can donate securely online right now at akaction.org. Thank you. As a reminder, a recording of today's call will be available on our website. And if you have additional questions or comments or suggestions for future Che Alaska Call topics, please contact us at 907-222-7714 or by email at diana@akaction.org. Thank you all very much again. Have a wonderful day.